Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Marina Basie. I'm City Councilor in the Northeast District. Today, I'm really excited to be partnering with Councilor McCourse to talk to you a little bit about some ideas and conversations that we've been having as it relates to public engagement, public comment, and really just transparency and engagement with our community. So maybe a little bit of backstory, because I like telling stories. One of the things that I did really intimately before choosing to run for city council was learn about the different meetings. And so, most people know about the Tuesday at 6 o'clock meeting. I call that the business meeting where we're voting and making decisions. But I learned about the 4 o'clock informational meeting. And that's something that I've been communicating to, especially a lot of neighborhood associations, for example, that if you really want to have a pulse on things as they're moving through the decision-making checkpoints, or kind of as things are coming up and being thought about, the 4 o'clock informational is very important. It literally is information. There's no decisions or voting that happens. What I also learned, and was candidly a little bit blown away about in my kind of discovery process, was how many different boards, committees, commissions, other public groups there were that city councilors sat on, but that also other community members sat on, that then informed recommendations to the council, recommendation to the mayor's office, that there were so many of these other groups going on. So fast forward a little bit, we, this last fall, had a lot of conversation as it relates to the Frank Olson project and the Parks Master Plan. One of the things that I personally did a lot was I shared with a lot of community members, hey, here's this informational meeting where we're talking about 80% schematic design or 60% or whatever those checkpoints were. Hey, the Parks Board meeting is coming up on this day. These are the things on the agenda. So there were a lot of community members that, by way of me communicating with them, were looking for ways to be involved on this really monumental generational project. What we learned is that there is some confusion and some challenge about what's the flow of these meetings. When do you give public comment? Can you give public comment? Who do you direct them to? Where do I find the agenda? And so it kind of just unraveled this, wait a minute, there's potentially a lack of continuity, maybe a lack of understanding. So that led into some conversations with some of my fellow councilors, which you'll hear from Councilor McCourse here shortly, but it also led into some staff research. And so we investigated all of the different boards, committees, and just took a pulse on what's happening with them, where are things posted, and we found that there are a lot of inconsistencies with where information can be found. So as we are ideating about how do we improve that, how do we empower community members who want to be engaged, to be able to be engaged and be able to be engaged early in the process, where do they go? How do they get informed? And more importantly, where do they direct their ideas, their feedback, their comments to? So we're in the early stages of this, and I'm really excited to invite Councilor McCourse because we've been ideating on a few things that he's going to share with you.
All right, thank you, Councilor. Thanks for being here today. I think Councilor Basie covered it well, that we had a situation arise last fall that really led to some more serious conversations regarding the committees in our community, and that led to an informational on December 2nd where we really went into depth on how meetings are posted, where you can find that information, and just got some ahas from that conversation about, wow, there's some inconsistencies happening here. Also, at the same time, we released the results of our National Community Survey from 2025. And in that National Community Survey, there's a section specifically on governance. And you can go and read that, and I don't know any other way to put it, but it's fairly humbling, and to be blunt, a little discouraging to read that section of the National Community Survey. For example, in that National Community Survey of Sioux Falls, specifically statistically valid, in 2019, 60% of the community believed that government was acting in open and transparent ways. In 2025, that dropped to 49%. And so that's concerning to see that. And that could have some national trends that are impacting that, could have state trends that are impacting that, whatever that might be, that's functional reality. And so we need to do what we can do on our end to improve that. And so we've got some different things Councilor Basie and I and others are talking about, and some focus areas that we want to say, hey, let's have some ideas on these different focus areas. There's 4 different focus areas that we want to encourage conversation around and see what we can do to improve things, civic engagement and trust in government. The first thing is we want to have consistent public input opportunities at public meetings. One of the things that came to fruition pretty quickly is, depending upon which committee you went to, sometimes you gave public input at the beginning of the meeting, sometimes at the end of the meeting, sometimes you gave it on the specific agenda item, other times you gave it during the general public input. And so we believe that public members should be able to come to a meeting and have clear expectation. It's consistent across community meetings. And so we want to talk about how do we accomplish that. Even us, some of the blame falls on us. For example, you come to our informational meeting. Our informational meeting is different than the regular meeting time limit and what can be talked about. So we need to discuss that, of how do we best empower people to provide that consistency. Another important element of that is when we're recruiting community members to serve on these committees and we're training them, I think it'd be really helpful to have consistent policies across the board of how we take it. So as they're leading the meeting, chairing it, or participating in it, they know what to expect and what's going to take place. So number 1 is providing that consistent public input opportunity across all committees and just finding the best way to do that on the same place on the agenda and make sure we're describing it when we're taking that part and during the agenda. Second thing we want to do is try to find ways to improve meeting notifications. There's 3 different kind of spots when we were doing our research that meeting notifications are noticed. There's a public calendar, there's a clerk's calendar, various places on the website, and then what I'm going to call an arcade situation, which is demanded by the state, is you put a notice on the door. I always tell people, like, what are the chances you're going to walk by that door on that day that notifies you that there's a meeting coming? So you got to know what door to go to and what day to go on that time. So we need to find a way to centralize our meeting notifications for the public. So I just want to have some ideas with the administration, some ideas with the public. What's the best way to accomplish that? And so talking about that as well. Third thing that we want to focus on is how can we improve our consistency? How can we improve our consistency of meeting location? We believe that there's some confusion right now between this committee meets over at City Center, this meeting meets at City Hall, this meeting meets at Carnegie, this other meeting maybe meets around the community at different times. For example, the Parks Board meets at different locations each month, and that is to show off some of the space, Parks and Rec space, but at the same time is the public's got to keep track of that. And also the Parks Board has recordings, so it'd be better that they're in one centralized location for really quality recordings, as the Parks Board has a lot of authority in our community and a lot of influence in our community. And so there's been different things throughout the history of the council that have been brought forward on that. So we want to build support again and build ideas forward of how we can get consistent meeting locations so the public has confidence on where to go. A final item, focus area, is really trying to find some ideas how we can improve our communication regarding our agenda previews for council meetings. Everything is publicly made known on Friday afternoons at 3 o'clock. That agenda is published, and I think the agenda does a great job of laying out what the agenda item is, who's the sponsor of it, gives a description of it. One of the functional realities is, though, there's very few community members that are digging in to the actual agenda, going down to that item. So we want to look at different ideas. Is there ways we can improve kind of an agenda preview? Here's what's coming, and here's kind of how the process is going to work. So hey, we're at first reading, which means that's going to happen now. Here's what first reading means. Here's a second reading coming, and so forth. And so we want to just talk about, are there any ideas that we can maybe put in place that would help us lay out so people can understand what's coming on the agenda? And I think Councilor Basie even noticed the conversation that's happening in the state as well right now that just kind of brings it to the top of mind of different things taking place.
Yeah, just the other day I noticed an article at the state level of incorporating video recordings of the different committee meetings, and that's something that has been brought up or ideated a little bit, and so I think that that'll be a great example for us to pay attention to and watch, and also inquire. Maybe there's notes or ideas that we can take from that, or maybe there's things that we want to put a little polish on and adjust for ourselves, but there's certainly lots of different conversations going on about different ideas, and that, and maybe at the risk of jumping into maybe what Councilor McCorris is going to get to. I think one of the biggest things that I would appreciate are the ideas and the feedback. I personally have circled this with a few neighborhood folks, knowing that this has been kind of on my brain and exploring. But I think that that's one of the biggest things that we could get from this conversation today is to have community members reach out with ideas or considerations. There's potentially other challenges or ideas that we haven't considered in just this commentary we're having today.
So that raises kind of the question of what's next for us in these focus areas. What's next? A couple of different things. We hope to be presenting again on January 27th at the informational meeting to talk about follow-up from the December 2nd informational meeting on what are some ways in which we can move these focus areas forward. And so that might be looking at some ordinance things, that might be looking at some staff role things, it might be looking at some process, whatever that might be, but continuing that conversation forward. But also, as Councilor Basie said, we want to just put the focus areas out there so we can start some conversations and get more ideas flowing. So contacts by email, reach out, set up a meeting to have a conversation with us. And we also want to reach out to community members that have served on these boards. I think we've got a lot of community members that have served on these boards maybe multiple times, and they've got feedback on what would improve their experience overall as well. So we want to start the conversation, and I want to kind of continue to move it forward, which really started back in December of this year. And the whole focus here is trying to improve civic engagement, continue to build that public trust in their government and the work that we're doing to make sure we're doing our part in regards to it. So those are the focus areas. Those are some of the areas we're looking forward to have more ideas from as well. Councilor Basie or myself would be happy to take any questions on that or other areas as well.
Can you talk a little bit about just the importance of civic engagement at the earlier stages of decision making? Because I think folks get demoralized pretty quickly when they show up to the council at second reading with an emotional plea, but they're at, like the 1 yard line of a decision going through. So what would you say to people who, are starting to get engaged, but maybe are feeling demoralized by their, maybe limited experiences of just showing up at second reading? What's a better time to get involved?
Great question. So the question was, why is it so important to get engaged earlier in the process rather than at second reading? And I think most people don't realize that most things that we're working on have been baking at least for 6 to 8 months, if not 2 to 4 years, and sometimes even longer than that. And I think most of the time we want to encourage people that it's so important to get involved early, because that's when city staff, for example, are meeting with these committees, and that's where some of the applicants or people that are involved are also in that detailed planning in that early stage of those committee things. But a lot of people don't even know that we've got a committee talking about it. So for example, use this as an example, tomorrow night, the Falls Park Master Plan is being released to the community for feedback. The council will have a vote on that in the month of February, but really the time to get feedback is to go to that tomorrow on Wednesday night, listen to it and say to the parks staff, hey, we see you said this or see you said this, but our feedback was this. Could you think about tweaking this? Because then they take that to the Parks Board next, and then from the Parks Board it comes to us. And so it's hard for us, for me personally at least, we've got a committee of volunteers on the Parks Board to really overturn work that they're doing. Otherwise it's kind of like, well, why do we have volunteers doing work there who are really engaged? And so it takes a lot for me to be convinced to overturn that volunteer board, for example, a Parks Board. So it's why it's important to get involved early on from my perspective.
I would also add to that in this Falls Park Master Plan conversation, we had an informational meeting about that just a couple weeks ago. I don't remember the date off the top of my head. And so that's another example of there's information that's flowing throughout the stage in the process. And, I like to think about anytime you're doing a research project, or if you're, talking to your kid about maybe their science fair project, if you will, you're not going to wait until the last minute to go through what you need to do and what you need to put in front of the judges. You're building that over time, and what you're working on and the conversations and what you're digging into evolves over time. So sometimes when something comes in front of us for a vote, it's a summary of the work that had been done or the research or the feedback. So it's really hard to reel all the way back and say, hey, I have this question about the 7 yard line, and now we're over here at we're in the end zone.
How much of this is just, let's take data centers for instance. Everybody showed up at that, a lot of people showed up at the meeting, said, just why, I imagine a lot of this is driven by that. You just dropped this on us, when in fact there have been news stories for 6 months at least about the data center. Everything the city does is streamed live. Everything the county does is streamed live. Everything the state does is streamed live. Stories get written all the time. How much of it is just apathy? And how do you overcome apathy? It's a little disingenuous to say, come show up at a second reading on the rezone about a data center and say, you just dropped this on us, you did this in secret. You know that. How do you change that?
Great question. The question was how much of the issue we're dealing with here is apathy towards things that people kind of don't care until that last juncture. First of all, I was trying to that as part of that could be they don't care maybe because they don't know, and we haven't made it simple enough for them to know. So that's one way that I'm trying to look at this through. For example, if I don't know they're talking about a Minnesota Avenue study right now, and the only time I really see it is when the council's considering it, I would say that potentially is an issue, that they don't understand. There's a committee meeting about active transportation right now of Minnesota Avenue from Rice to 229, and that's how it's all working. So we don't simplify to make that easier to engage on that. Now, we're not expecting the whole community, but we know there are community members who really care about those various specific things that are looking to get involved earlier in the process. So is there apathy? I don't doubt that at all. This is, I think, a functional reality. The media landscape has changed. And I don't say this in a negative way, but media landscape, for example, in the last 15 years, if you looked at homes 15 years ago of who they were listening to 15 years ago, there was probably only 2 or 3 voices in that home via print, online, or TV. Today, that's massively different. I'm not sure if there's one market or one voice that's got a 50% presence in 50% of the homes in Sioux Falls. That's changed things dramatically. I think that's a big piece of this puzzle, and so there's more responsibility on us of getting some information out there. That's my personal perspective.
I would agree with the comments that Councilor McCourse made. A few other things that are going through my brain is that this conversation, in my opinion, doesn't exist because of the data center conversation, but it's a result. It is evidence that we need to be having these conversations about engaging people. There's the emotional side of it that we don't have control over. We can't choose other people's priorities, or we can't make people care about something, but we can do our due diligence to make things easy and accessible, and that would be my objective. Also, making it easy for people to be able to decide where are their passion areas and what things do they want to get involved in. We have so many, I don't know, it's like 30 or 40 some different boards and committees. Not everybody has to be involved in every single one of them or keep a pulse on every single one of them, but maybe there are certain areas that they find themselves really passionate in, and if we can try to engage folks in that way, maybe that's a way to help inspire them to care about specific areas.
What kind of qualifications are you looking for someone to be on a board or a committee?
Repeat the question.
So the question is qualifications that are sought after for folks to be on a board or a committee. Typically, each board or committee has an application process or has details about the kinds of decisions that they make. So for example, I sit on the UDC, the Urban Development Commission, and we've got different kind of subcommittees of that where there is in the bylaws or in the way that the UDC is structured, there is specific criteria. So I think it would be hard to answer that generally, but it would be based on that board or committee. And I know there's information on the city website, but if somebody is interested in a particular area, there's probably us as city councilors or staff could help point them in a direction of what kind of board or commission might be appropriate for their experience or passion.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the keys is the mayor is responsible for appointing to these board and commission, and the council gives formal approval after that. But really, it's the administration's opportunity, and that's really one of the big powers of the mayor's office, is putting people in these different roles that are helping in the very early stages of active transportation, parks, planning commission, et cetera. And so the mayor's office has got that application process where we encourage people to get your name in there, ask them what opportunities they think exist, et cetera. And I think the big piece is I tell people is probably looking for individuals who have been engaged in the community. So you got to start somewhere, and talk to the local chamber office, find a local nonprofit, get on that board, so you've got experience. You can say, hey, I've been involved in this way, I've got experience working on a committee, and that I think will help. At least that would, if I was serving as mayor, that'd be a big difference to me if someone that's got experience working on a board or a committee.
I would maybe just add one more comment before we get to your question, is you can also just show up. You can show up to these boards and committees and kind of get a flavor for what kind of conversations that they're having too. There's nothing that says that you have to be on them, right, in order to attend.
Yeah, so just to use data centers again as an example here, I know recently there's been a group popping up calling for a vote on that rezoning ordinance that you guys passed here. But is the goal here to kind of get those people in earlier at those earlier levels here so you can get them aware of these things that are going on, these ordinances that are passing, these informational meetings that you guys are having, and get those people so that they're more aware of this process and coming to you guys earlier? Is that kind of the goal here?
So the question is the goal to get people engaged earlier in the process? Yes, that's where when something first starts, that's where you have the biggest opportunity to impact the outcome. So if you are baking a cake, for example, if you put sprinkles in when you're mixing the batter, well, now you have a funfetti cake. But if you put sprinkles in after you've baked the cake on the top, you don't have a funfetti cake. You haven't made that impact. So I think I think that ultimately, yes, that's the goal, but it's also the information that's out there. And going back to some of the earlier questions and comments, sometimes when it comes to a vote, we're not rehashing every single detail that went in to the plan or the strategy or whatever it is that the vote is on, because those things have been discussed through each stage in the process.
Should refer everybody to Megan's Civics 101.
Hey, thanks.
I'm vaguely recalling some sort of controversy or frustration about Sioux Falls Parks and Rec a couple of years ago. Was it transparency, something like that, or a closed meeting? Does that sound familiar? I don't remember. Okay, I'm just kind of wondering if that would be something applicable to what you're talking about today.
Is Parks and Rec, do they allow public input? I can't remember.
Yeah, the question was, does Parks and Rec allow public input? The answer to that is yes, they do allow public input. This did stem, though, from some meetings last fall with Parks and Rec regarding the consistency of do they take public input at each agenda item or at just general public input time? And that's where we got some feedback from some citizens that, for example, that had come, they thought there was going to be input on each agenda item, and so they actually didn't get to speak about what they had prepared some material on because they were taking input during the general public input time on it. So we want to just have some conversation. How do we clear that up so it's consistent between the Parks and Rec Board, the Active Transportation Board, informational meeting, et cetera, so people have a clear expectation? Because as it's already been said, people aren't living in this government stuff every day. So when they show up, we want to have some clarity for them. Other questions that we can answer?
Do you people, in my observation, spending a lot of time in mind-numbingly dull meetings, because that's city government, a lot of times the actual staffers on site don't know the basic rules of how to conduct a meeting. Do you feel like there's room here? And Attorney General Jackley has been doing some required training that I'm not exactly sure is getting done the way he would like it. Because when I watch these meetings sometimes, there's just mistakes made. They're little procedural mistakes. But people don't know how to run a meeting, even when they're city employees, let alone volunteer. Do you find that true, and how do you solve that?
It's a great question. The question is, do we find there's inconsistency in the training and the equipping of the individual staffers that are running the meetings or are active at the meetings? Is that a fair representation of the question? So
Violate the open meetings law.
So I believe the attorney's office last year put together their first training following that state law, and last year, I don't have this 100% certain that they did the first training of that. For example, we received our first training on that as the council of that, and we'll annually receive that from the city attorney's office. I do think that there is more work to be done there, and that's maybe one of the ideas that we need to focus on. One of the ideas of bringing consistency across committees is that then you're training each staff member on the same of how it works at that committee meeting. I think that could be really helpful to know that every public input happens at this place in the agenda, no matter what city meeting you're at, and here's kind of how that would work. So we want to try to maybe simplify that a little bit, and maybe you just brought forward a really important idea today of, in that focus area, we've got to step up the training. I've seen, like one of the things I've seen, for example, is the volunteer chairperson of that committee meeting is gone that day. And so they're looking around, somebody else has got to be the chairperson. They come in, they haven't chaired a meeting. They haven't chaired a meeting before, and you're dealing with some fairly heavy things, and on the spot, you're dealing with how to handle emotion, et cetera. So that's a great point. There's some conversation that needs to be had on that front of training and equipping and making sure we got the appropriate staff member present during that meeting. Any other questions today? I really appreciate everybody's time and hope the community will engage in helping us come up with other ideas on these focus areas. Thank you.